Hello, I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. This community partnership is dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver, Interneighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Our mission today is to present a ballot issue forum in anticipation of the general election coming up on Tuesday, November 3rd. Among the numerous amendments and ordinance questions on this year's ballot is referred measure 2H. This measure asks voters if the city and county of Denver should reestablish the city's right to provide all internet services restricted since 2005 by Senate Bill 152. Our format for this forum will follow a basic debate outline with opening and closing statements, cross-examination, and will include responses to questions submitted by our forum organizers. Let's begin by meeting the participants on the pro and con side of Measure 2H. Beginning to my right is Council Member Paul Cashman, who represents District 6 on the Denver City Council, and he will be speaking in favor of Referred Measure 2H. And on my left is Mr. Ray Gifford, who is the former chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission and currently the managing partner of the Denver office of the law firm Wilkinson Barker Nauer. He has practiced and taught regulatory law for more than 20 years and represents cable and telecommunications companies, electric and gas utilities, and transportation network providers. He will be speaking against Referred Measure 2H. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
We will begin with 1-minute opening statements from both of you. Councilmember Cashman, you are up first.
Well, thank you, Russell. It's good to be here this evening. As the internet is the 21st century portal to the world of information, much as our brick and mortar libraries were for centuries, it's essential that that portal be open to all, regardless of station in life. Unfortunately, while most of our city has the needed access, the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census states that some 20% of Denver households still do not have a broadband connection, and that it happens most frequently in our underserved communities of color. Senate Bill 152, passed in 2005, prevents cities like Denver from offering direct broadband services to residents and businesses. An exemption from 152 does not come with or even imply a particular solution. It does not come with a price tag. It does, however, allow all options to be on the table. I hope you will look at this situation and vote in favor of 2H.
Councilman, thank you for that opening statement in favor of Referred Measure 2H. And now an opening statement from Mr. Gifford speaking against Referred Measure 2H.
Thank you, Councilman. Nice to see you. The question of whether there should be government-owned broadband networks is, in some sense, a solution in search of an answer. If you say that the government should or could be operating broadband networks, you have to first define what the problem is you're trying to solve. What the councilman said, I think, is that we have an adoption problem and we have an accessibility problem. Well, I'm here to say we don't have an accessibility problem in Denver. In fact, Denver is one of the most thoroughly and completely wired communities in the nation, with 2 competitive broadband providers offering speeds in the gigabit per second range. Our problem is an adoption problem. And that's where I think the solutions need to come from. And an adoption problem does not take government-owned broadband to accomplish.
Mr. Gifford, thank you for that opening statement. I believe I heard a bit of a rebuttal in that statement as well, but now you do have time, an extra minute for a rebuttal to the councilman's opening statement.
Well, I think the councilman and I actually do agree on certain things, that broadband is a vital part of life in the 21st century. It's vital for a job, it's vital for education, and if it's one thing we've learned the past 6 months during the pandemic, it's vital for existing in any mode of life. There is that cohort of people who do not subscribe to broadband. And the question is, why don't they subscribe to broadband? And what solutions can we as policymakers, we as private enterprise come up to reach those folks and get them connected to the internet? And that's where I think we should focus our attention, not on looking at the government running its own broadband network, because that, for the most part, has never ended well.
Mr. Gifford, thank you for that. And now, Councilman Cashman, you have 1 minute to offer a rebuttal to Mr. Gifford's statements.
Sure. I think what Mr. Gifford is missing, and what a lot of people miss, is we're not talking about government providing broadband. What we're talking about is being able to facilitate a community-wide discussion of all options on the table. The Denver providers have done a good job of connecting large portions of our city, but unfortunately, 20%, as the surveys have shown, are still not connected. Now, Mr. Gifford is correct in that it's not a silver bullet situation. You need three things to reach the internet. You need a device with which to make that connection. You need the knowledge of how to use that device. And then you do need that broadband access to get you through to the world of information. The discussion that I envision is a community-wide discussion of all three of those areas. But as 120 plus cities and dozens of counties have found, it's important to get free of 152 to have that discussion.
Councilman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, both of you, thank you very much for those opening statements and rebuttals. We're now moving on to cross-examination, and this is a chance for both of you to ask questions of the other. And Councilman Cashman, we will start with you. Cross-examination round one. You can ask a question of Mr. Gifford.
Sure. Ray and I spoke for a minute before coming in this evening, and one question I have in general is why the broadband companies wouldn't want to partner with the community at large with an open heart to solve the problems we're having with students struggling to get connected for online education, and for patients, mental health patients, physical health patients, struggling to get connected for telehealth visits. The gaps are real. As a partnership, we can solve it. I really welcome our providers into that partnership.
Mr. Gifford, I believe there was a question in there, perhaps.
No,
feel free to answer. You have 1 minute.
No, I actually think that our providers are embracing that challenge and are embracing that partnership. If you look at programs like Comcast Internet Essentials, which provide low-income individuals with $10 a month broadband connections that are sufficient to do Zoom classes, sufficient to do telehealth, that is an effort, and it's a meritorious effort to get people connected. The best studies that I've seen as to why people don't subscribe to broadband is not that they can't get it at a low price. It's that they either don't want it, absolutely, and I'm not sure we can do much about that, or they're in communities that are not native English speakers, very insular communities. And I think we can all do better in reaching out to those communities to bring them into the broader, broadband world.
Gentlemen, let's continue the conversation. Mr. Gifford, it's now your turn to cross-examine the councilman. You can ask him a question.
Well, Councilman, you said that you just want to put all solutions on the table. Mm-hmm. Do you think that government-owned and government-run broadband networks are really a plausible solution that Denver or any community should embrace?
Well, I'm not looking at any other community. I'm looking at Denver. And while our major providers have wired most of the city, it has been decades now that we've had these providers in our city, and we still have 20% of our cities not hooked up. We need to solve that. Whether Denver Denver has miles and miles of cable fiber in the ground. All of our traffic lights are connected throughout the city. So if there might be a neighborhood that the providers find they can't connect cost efficiently, perhaps it's a good idea for us to look at that. But again, we're not talking about particular solutions. We're just talking about putting all options on the table, have a community-wide discussion, including the broadband providers, to come at a solution that it's only just that we find.
Councilman, thank you. And now continuing cross-examination. This is round 2. Mr. Gifford, you can ask another question, and you get to go first.
Another question?
Yes.
Well, wasn't I shorted a question here?
You'll get another one in round 2 as well.
Thank you,
Councilman.
Councilman, do you contend that there are neighborhoods in Denver that simply don't have any broadband infrastructure built?
No. There may be small portions. My last understanding is that our providers have a wire in the ground or in the air for up in the mid-90s% of our community. What I'm saying is somehow we're not getting the connection into the house with the connection, the device, and the knowledge to use it. We need to attack all 3 of those. As long as DPS is struggling to get their students connected, and our mental health providers are struggling to get their patients connected, we've got to do better. I'm not, and for Denver, and I'm just an individual, I look out at Denver and I see a deepened partnership with our providers, but if they are unable to meet the task, then we would need to step in.
Councilman, thank you. Mr. Gifford, thank you. And now, Councilman, you can ask another question of Mr. Gifford. This is cross-examination round 2. We'll have 4 rounds.
Sure, sounds great. So while we often get mired in this discussion of do you want the city to provide broadband? What would be the solution? What I would ask is, what would the negative be for Denver to get free of the restrictions of 152? I don't see anything, any negative for Denver.
Mr. Gifford.
Thank you, and thank you, Councilman. I think the negative would be it's a distraction from the real challenge and the real issue that we've been discussing, which is adoption of broadband and how do we reach those who do not subscribe for whatever reason. And of course, if they really don't want to subscribe, we don't want to make them subscribe. But what 152 does is it's a distraction from that core adoption problem and puts at issue the question of, does the city of Denver want to get into the broadband business, as many cities around the country have done, and where it has not ended well in most cases. I wouldn't say that municipal broadband never works, but it usually ends very badly and in financial ruin.
Mr. Gifford, thanks for that response. And now you can ask another question of the councilman.
Councilman, with Denver being one of the leading edge cities for fifth generation wireless deployment, which promises wireless speeds on par with wired broadband, why would we want to put on the table the option of building out a new terrestrial broadband network when we're on the brink of seeing a wireless network built by private enterprise and private providers, bringing more competition and more options?
Sure. Well, I'll repeat myself that we're not putting anything in particular on the table. We're just putting all options to solving a critical problem of opening the world of information to all of our families, not just the most fortunate. We wouldn't build a house or an apartment without light and heat and water. And we should not be giving certificates of occupancy without broadband connections. It's not a luxury anymore. We're hamstringing our students, we're hamstringing our business people, and as I've said, we were learning in this situation we never expected how critically important it is, not a luxury, to have broadband. So we need to get together as a community and figure out, how do we get the devices, how do we teach them how to use it, and how do we get that last mile or that last few feet from the ground into the house.
Councilman, thank you. Mr. Gifford, thank you. Moving on to cross-examination round 3. Councilman, we'll start with you. You can ask a question of Mr. Gifford.
You know, it's such a simple situation. I'm kind of lost for particular questions. The main question is, why wouldn't we have why would an exemption from 152 harm our community? And the only thing I've heard is a vague, it would be a distraction. I have more faith in our community than that. You know, the discussion I envision, Mr. Gifford, involves your client, Comcast and CenturyLink and any other providers that might want to come to the table. Do you not think that would be a productive discussion?
Yeah, and I think we've been having that discussion, and at some level, we may disagree on certain facts. And the certain fact that I think we probably disagree on is this. I believe it's the case that every home and apartment in Denver has access to terrestrial wired broadband, either through CenturyLink or Comcast. It's not as if we have neighborhoods or even houses that have plumbing, that have electricity, that have natural gas, but no broadband connection. When we built out the telephone network at the advent of the last century, they had to build everywhere. When cable built under its franchises in the 60s and 70s, they had to build everywhere. Those companies are there with those connections. What we don't need to do is interrupt that competitive dynamic that benefits all of us with a third unfair competitor, namely the government.
Mr. Gifford, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, both for obeying the time limits as well. Mr. Gifford, you can ask one final question of the councilman.
Councilman, this isn't a good enough debate yet, but I think we agree that the core of the problem is answering the adoption question, which is, how do we get that 20% of the community onto the internet, and how do we get them to adopt using broadband? Do you think it's an adoption question or it's a network question?
I think the question is the three-part question of the device, the knowledge to use it, and the connection. I think the evidence that proves that true is the 120 plus cities and dozens of counties in Colorado who have taken the exemption from 152. Some have built out their own internet systems. Some have deepened their partnerships with the principal providers, and some have just had a discussion and decided, we'll sit where we are. Again, this comes with no price tag. All it does is open up a discussion where all solutions are on the table. We have no idea. You mentioned 5G earlier. We have no idea where technology is going to go, and we also have no idea where our current partners are going to go. And we need to be able to step into the breach at a moment's notice if need be, and not be hamstrung by needless legislation.
Councilman, thank you. Just to keep this fair, I believe you're behind by one question, so if you'd like to ask one final question of Mr. Gifford, you can do so, Councilman.
You know what? I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I think we've hit the main issues. I'd be glad to hear what the sponsors have to ask.
Fair enough. Thank you, Councilman, and thank you, Mr. Gifford. And we really appreciate the respectful debate here today from both of you.
We
gentlemen.
had it out in the parking lot earlier. So.
I'm going to start interrupting him now.
Yeah, I saw you guys duking it out there. No, you guys were respectful outside as well. Anyway, moving on to the round of questions from the debate organizers. And we have 2 questions here. Each of you will again have 1 minute to answer each of these questions. So we are starting, I believe, with Councilman Cashman. Councilman Cashman, this is about schools and connecting to the internet. Denver Public Schools has struggled to connect many students with online learning, and numerous health providers, including Mental Health Center of Denver, have had challenges connecting with clients for telehealth visits. I believe you mentioned that already in this debate. And obviously, a lot of this has to do with the situation we're in right now, the global pandemic. Will this measure address issues like these?
Well, the measure will set the groundwork to precisely address those questions, the 3-pronged questions. I'll keep repeating it because it's at the central core of what we need to do. We need to figure out the connection. We need to figure out how to get them the devices they need, and we need to figure out how to teach them how to use it. Denver Public Schools has done a great job working with some of the providers as well as other companies in getting devices for kids in need. They've worked in getting hotspots for kids that don't have connections, as has Denver Public Library. But those are far from ideal, and they're not solving the problem. Everyone is telling us the same thing. This proposal is endorsed by Mayor Hancock, unanimously by City Council, by Denver Public Library, by Mental Health Center of Denver, by District Attorney General Phil Weiser, and many others.
Councilman, thank you for that response. Mr. Gifford, the same question. We're living in a different world right now. Denver Public Schools struggling to connect many students, telehealth visits. Will this measure address issues like that?
No, not at all, and that's why I called it a distraction. What we have been talking about is how do we reach people who are not currently connected to the internet. Those people are not going to get connected to the internet if the city of Denver builds its own broadband network. How we're going to get them connected to the internet is through targeted outreach, through sedulous hard work, by finding out what their specific issues are, be it cost, be it language, be it internet literacy. All of those are part of the solution for both teleeducation and telehealth. Looking into or putting on the table a government-owned broadband network accomplishes nothing toward those very real and very shared goals to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Gifford. Thank you, Councilman. Moving on to card question 2, and this is on the topic of Comcast. Comcast is already obligated to offer a level of broadband services to residents. What happens to Comcast if this passes?
Well, I don't think anything happens to Comcast if this passes. You've got 2 robust providers in the residential broadband providers in the city and county of Denver, Comcast and CenturyLink. They've been competing. They've been upping their speeds. They have not been increasing their costs. What you have happen and what you want to fear is when you get a government competitor who also enters that market, what does that do to the competitive dynamic of that market? And what we've seen in other cities around the country is it does nothing good for them. And the government, for the most part, loses its shirt. So again, that's why I say 2H is a distraction to the real problems that the councilman and I think agree on, which are how do we find and solve the problem of those 10 to 20% of Denver residents who don't have access to broadband right now.
Mr. Gifford, thank you. Same question for you, Paul. Comcast is already obligated, and for that matter, as Mr. Gifford mentioned, CenturyLink as well, to offer a level of broadband services to all residents. What happens to those two entities?
Nothing happens to them, certainly off the bat. What happens is they'd be welcome to sit down and have a discussion on how to do what they've failed to do in all the years they've been bringing services to Denver, and that is hook up the 20% of our families in need of these services that don't have them, regardless of what the reason is. As our major providers, it has been their responsibility to make the connections, and they've done a partial job of doing it. I don't grade them an F at all, but I don't grade them an A+ either. We've got people in need that need these services, and what I'm hearing from Mr. Gifford is the problem is they're afraid that the lock they have on their current profit margin may be threatened. I don't believe that to be the case, but I do believe by getting free of 152 puts us in a position to ask a little bit more of them, to stretch them a little bit out of their comfort zone.
Gentlemen, thank you. That brings us to the end of the Q&A section of this debate, and now we're moving on to closing statements. Each of you will have 1 minute to offer a closing statement, and Mr. Gifford, we're reversing the order of the opening statements. That means you get to go first.
For the question of government-owned networks, there are four issues that we can think about. One is competition. What I've heard today is there is not a competition problem in Denver. The second is availability. I contend there is not an availability problem of broadband in Denver. And in fact, those customers, I am sure either Comcast or CenturyLink would be very happy to serve those 20% of the unserved, of the folks who do not yet subscribe to broadband. But it's not an availability problem, it's an adoption problem. And the adoption problem, I agree, is real. There's been study by the FCC, by the Benton Foundation, of how do we reach these communities that do not subscribe to broadband. And it's a tough question, but it's a question that is not going to be solved by the government getting into the broadband business.
Mr. Gifford, thank you for that closing statement. Councilman, now you have 1 minute to deliver your closing.
Sure. The availability, the access is not there for 20% of our families. If it is a matter of cost, which it is for many families around Denver, even though there are some low-cost services offered, it's not doing its job. It's got to be available to our kids. It's got to be available to our families, our businesses, our patients. Getting this exemption, as I said, there's no downside for Denver. We've heard the vague notion that it would be some kind of distraction. I have great faith in the people of the city and county of Denver to get to the heart of the matter and figure out how we get these homes connected. Fort Collins has figured it out one way. Centennial has figured it out another way. Greenwood Village has gotten an exemption, and I don't believe has taken any action. It just sets the table for a discussion.
Councilman Paul Cashman, thank you very much for that closing statement. Mr. Ray Gifford, thank you very much for your participation here. Gentlemen, really, way to go. A very robust, respectful conversation here, and I'm sure the viewer was served well by that. So on behalf of the organizers of this forum, thank you for being here. We hope we have given you a fair look at the pros and cons for Preferred Measure 2H. Again, Preferred Measure 2H asks voters of the city and county of Denver if we should reestablish the city's right to provide all internet services restricted since 2005 by Senate Bill 152. Our thanks also to Denver Decides and its partners, which include Interneighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd. Let your voice be heard. Be sure you're registered and get out there and vote. For complete election information online, go to denverdecides.org. I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7. Thank you for joining us.